Now, Ask Dr. Love with psychotherapist, author, love and relationship expert Jamie Turndorf, Ph.D. For expert advice on love and relationships, call into the show at 888-463-6748. That's 888-GO-FOR-IT. Or you can submit your question online at AskDrLove.com. Now, here's Dr. Love.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to Ask Dr. Love. I'm Dr. Jamie Turndorf, and I'm very happy to be with you again today to talk about an epidemic in our society, bullying, what causes it, and how to stop it. And a little later in the show, I'm going to be introducing you to Jef Gazley, LMFT. Jeff's a practicing marriage and family therapist who specializes in bullying, and he's the founder of AskTheInternetTherapist.com. So, let's get on to today's show. Bullying, intimidating, scapegoating. We all know what it is because we've all been on the receiving end of it at one point in our lives or another. Now, I decided to do this show because for the first time in 30 years, in 1 year alone, I've had two 12-year-old girls come to me for therapy because they were the victims of bullying themselves. And one of the girls actually ended up in the ER from a potentially fatal overdose of Tylenol after having been cyberbullied on Facebook. So, I was preparing for the show, and I meditated on the question of why bullying and scapegoating happens. And right afterwards, I went to see my acupuncturist so she could needle me. I know it sounds dangerously akin to bullying, but I promise you it's not. So I'm lying there with the needles in me, imitating a human pincushion, and I hear the ruckus of squawking birds. And I look outside the window, and I see a clutch of fighting roosters. And a large rooster is bullying a skinny little one, blockading him from the food. So right before my eyes, I'm witnessing bullying in action as a strong animal preys upon a weak one. And this scene echoes what occurs throughout the entire animal kingdom, in which a weak and wounded animal becomes a sitting duck to a predator. The human kingdom is no different. Human bullies prey upon weak targets. But what most people don't know is that beneath their tough exteriors, bullies are actually weaklings, sheep in wolves' clothing. So think about Hitler, the quintessential bully who brutally scapegoated and murdered an entire race, but who privately saw himself as a weakling and actually had his partner urinate on him. So let me just start by defining bullying and scapegoating, which are one and the same, by the way. I'm going to use the terms interchangeably. Scapegoating is a hostile, social, psychological discrediting operation where people move blame and responsibility away from themselves and towards a target person or group. And it's also a practice where angry feelings and inappropriate accusation are placed on others, and the target feels wrongly accused, persecuted, and misplaced vilification and misplaced blame and criticism, and the victim is likely to suffer rejection from those who the perpetrator seeks to influence. Scapegoating has a wide range of focus from approved enemies of very large groups of people down to the scapegoating of individuals by other individuals. And the scapegoater's target always experiences exclusion, ostracism, or even expulsion from the group. And distortion is always a feature of scapegoating. As a general rule, people who bully were either bullied or observed bullying during their formative years. And through the process of identification, children actually learn to behave like the bully of their youth. Now, because a bullied child is too frightened to share his or her scared, weak, helpless, and angry feelings with the abuser, the painful feelings get shoved under the emotional rug. But since feelings can't remain buried forever, the bullied child ends up releasing his or her pain by passing on the pain to a weak target like a younger sibling or vulnerable schoolmates. And as adults, these same victims dump the pain they suffered onto their helpless children, employees, or spouses. The technical name for this dumping process is projection. And yes, the projection defense is behind all bullying and scapegoating. Now, with the projection defense, feelings of guilt, aggression, blame, and suffering are transferred away from the person or the group so as to fulfill an unconscious drive to resolve or avoid bad feelings. And this is done by the displacement of responsibility and blame to the other, who serves as a target for blame, both for the scapegoater and the scapegoater's supporters. Now, the problem with defense mechanisms, not just projection, but all defense mechanisms, is they operate out of our conscious awareness. And in a seamless fashion, they enable us to release feelings without our ever having to feel or face them. So in this way, the person who is doing projection turns the other person into an emotional toilet bowl and flushes the unwanted emotional poison onto the other person without the poison ever touching him or herself. Now, because the mechanism is unconscious, the perpetrator's drive to displace and transfer responsibility away from him or herself may not be experienced with full consciousness, and it often isn't. And this means that denial and self-deception is often a huge feature. And the point is, projection is a sign of great emotional weakness and an inability to face or sit with our own pain and work it through. Now, obviously, bullying is a behavioral way of venting incredible anger that's festering as a result of having been mistreated. Now, if you've read my columns or my book, Till Death Do Us Part, or you've listened to my show, you've heard me talk about fight traps, those dysfunctional ways that people vent their anger on others. And I talk about open warfare fight traps like name-calling, character assassination, sarcasm. These are the overt tactics that people use to outwardly dump rage on others. And any or all of these open warfare tactics are part of the bully's arsenal. So I want you to keep in mind that even though the bully may exhibit angry behavior, don't be fooled into thinking that anger is the primary emotion. Because humans, like animals, have a habit of puffing themselves up, beating the breast, and engaging in fearsome and threatening acts in order to cover up intense feelings of vulnerability, hurt, sadness, fear. So in addition to ridding unwanted feelings, bullying can also be caused by self-hatred. Can you believe it? So, for example, when bulliers see traits in their children or spouses that remind them of an aspect of themselves that they don't like, they project their own self-hate onto the other person. In this case, the psyche is saying, if I can put the blame on you, I don't have to recognize and take responsibility for the negative qualities in myself. And what I can't stand about myself, I really hate in you, and I have to attack you for it in order to deny that I have the same quality. Now, bullying can also be the result of low self-esteem. In this case, scapegoaters raise their own status by lowering the status of their target. Bet you've seen that happen. Now, I want to talk a little bit about bullying and scapegoating as it happens in families. Scapegoating is a serious family dysfunction where one member of the family is blamed for small things, picked on, and constantly put down. And in scapegoating, one of the authority figures has made a decision that somebody in the family has to be the bad guy. The mother or father makes one bad child and then looks for things, makes one child bad. I said one bad child, makes one child bad and then looks for things, sometimes real, but most often imagined, that are wrong. And now, there are different reasons why a child may be singled out or scapegoated. Maybe the child is small or sick, weak, vulnerable, or maybe incapable of defending him or herself, hyperactive, non-compliant, or acting out, okay? Now, at times, the parent heaps on the blame because the parent can't stand the child who has traits and characteristics that are similar to his or her own, and sometimes the child has personality traits that are similar to a disliked relative. You might have heard a bullier say, oh, she reminds me of my sister who I never liked. And other children in the family will then pick up the scapegoating pattern and join in taunting and hurting the scapegoated child. And in extremely dysfunctional families, the parent may even goad the other children to pick on the disfavored one. Now, sometimes one child is favored and given special status by the bullying parent. And this child can do no wrong, according to the parent, when they're growing up. But being the favorite always hurts that kid too, because children who are favored develop their own form of pathology where they grow up feeling special and entitled. And one woman who I treated said, I resented my sister who was my mother's favorite, and I wished I had been special to my mother, but now I see how messed up my sister is, and I'm glad that I wasn't the chosen one of a very crazy mom. Okay, so now when scapegoating occurs, all members of the family are affected. Children who are scapegoated often feel insecure, and they develop a victim mentality, and they learn that they're at the bottom of the pecking order in the family, and they often automatically gravitate to that role at school or at work. You've seen it, I'm sure, where the kid just walks in and has like a sign on himself saying, "Dump on me, I'm a target at home," and it just happens that way through unconscious, energetic transmission of a message. And the dynamic of making one child good and another child bad in the family is a vicious generational theme that's just learned and passed down from parents to children. It just keeps on going. Now, often an insecure parent is going to be aggressive with one of the children to vent his own or her own sense of frustration at not doing well in life, like my boss dumped on me, so I'm going to go home and kick the dog, or the weakest family member. Aggression in families does create a decrease in self-esteem in the children, obviously, because the aggression, the use of force against another human being, is always present in scapegoating, and so the person who's on the receiving end has to suffer, the domination, the aggressiveness, which can take several forms, like rude, humiliating statements like, "What do you mean? You aren't going to do it?" Or the aggressive person can become self-righteous. "I'm only insisting on this for your own good." Or she can resort to being manipulative. "If you refuse, what will everyone think of you?" Now, it's important for you to know that when one child is being scapegoated in a family, that scapegoating is being sanctioned by the parents. In other words, the scapegoating serves the parents' needs in some way. You can't believe how many times I've encountered families in which parents give an unconscious green light to one of their children to beat up on his or her sibling or other children as a way of righting the wrong that he or she suffered as a child. And as the child or children who aren't being bullied quickly learn to join forces with the bully to protect themselves from becoming the target of aggression, they then learn to become bullies themselves. Let me tell you, I had a patient. This is a really tragic example of this. His name was John. And some years ago, he was brutalized and actually raped by his own brother. And their father looked the other way. And when John came to see me as a grown man, he was a total wreck. He was so riddled with anxiety and terror that he shook all the time. He shook so badly that he couldn't even write out a check to me. Not good for business, right? So as I dug in and I talked to this guy, I uncovered all the details of John's story, and I found out that his own father had been damaged in his childhood. And specifically, his father felt that his younger sister was favored while his parents punished him. And the father harbored a mountain of resentment toward his baby sister. And when he grew up and had kids of his own, his unconscious arranged to right the wrong he suffered. And he unconsciously gave his older son license to bully and torture his younger child, my patient John. And by doing this, the father vicariously vented his own rage at his younger sister, using his older son as the weapon. And of course, he destroyed his innocent son in the process, and the son who he allowed to be his spokesperson ended up actually psychotic. I'm sure that it just shattered his mind, the monstrosities that he was allowed to do to his brother. Now, I'm going to take a brief break. When I come back, I'm going to talk with you a little bit more about bullying and how to intervene and break the cycle in your own life. And then we'll meet my new guest in a moment. So let me just take a break, and I'll be back with you in a moment on Ask Dr. Love.
You're listening to Ask Dr. Love with Dr. Jamie Turndorf. To speak to Dr. Turndorf live on the air, call 888-463-6748. AskDrLove.com is the web's premier relationship advice site since 1996. Visit AskDrLove.com to search thousands of free relationship advice articles on any relationship issue you may have. Or you can submit a question to her free advice column. However, if you're listening live, why not call in? Don't be shy. Dr. Turndorf wants to help you, and this is a unique chance to get a personal answer from one of today's most respected experts. So, if you have a question for her, please call in now at 888-463-6748. That's 888-463-6748. Now back to Ask Dr. Love with Jamie Turndorf, Ph.D. Once again, here's Dr. Love.
Hello again, and welcome back to Ask Dr. Love Radio. I'm Dr. Jamie Turndorf, and I'm talking about bullying and scapegoating today, what causes it, and how to stop it. Before I took the break, I promised to share with you some specific techniques for ending bullying, but I wanted to say one thing. Bullying is often a primitive form of communication where the bullier tries to have other people feel what he or she felt as a kid. But sadly, of course, this form of communication damages others in the process. Now, you may wonder why people don't just choose to describe their pain to others without laying it on them. But that takes strength. To describe your feelings, you have to feel them and own them. Bullying gets rid of the feelings without your having to face and feel them. So, let me give you an example. I have a patient who was picked on and bullied by his older brothers. Now, each time his wife acts weak and helpless, he goes off and behaves like his older brothers and bullies her for her weakness. And in therapy, I helped him to realize that her weakness triggers his own wound. Without consciously realizing it, her weakness feels like he's looking at his young self in the mirror. And rather than feel weak, he unconsciously turns the tables. He takes on the role of the bully, and he gets to rewrite his history so that this time around he becomes the bullier instead of the victim. And doing so allows him to vent all his pent-up anger at his brothers, and in the process he's inflicting the pain he suffered on his poor wife. So I asked him just a couple weeks ago, why would you want her to suffer the pain you felt as a boy? And he immediately said, so she'll know how it felt for me when I was a kid. And then I was able to help him see that he could help her to understand how he felt by describing what he went through and how he suffered without actually inflicting the pain on her. And that was all he needed to break the cycle. And I also want you to know one other little thing. It's not a little thing, it's a big thing. Bullying and scapegoating is often a sign of marital distress. So, what happens is, the best way to unify a group is to unite around an enemy. By ganging up on a child, spouses actually glue together a marriage or a relationship that's coming apart at the seams. And many parents gang up on their children and unite against the enemy in an unconscious attempt to solidify that bond that's fraying. Now, I've seen this happen time and time again over the years. A couple comes in asking me to fix their problematic, troubled, defective, misbehaved kid. Meanwhile, the real problem is the parents. I had a couple this week who described their son who tortures the dog, bullies the siblings, and he just acts out all over the place. But in reality, the marriage is in shambles. The kid treats the animals and the siblings the way his parents treat each other. Remember, the apple doesn't fall far from the tree. So, here's a roadmap for ending bullying and scapegoating. Remember, first of all, that scapegoating is going to be difficult to resolve because the motivations for the behavior are unconscious. So it makes it easy for the bullier to deny. And it's also hard to stop because it serves multiple psychological functions. And on top of all these obstacles, scapegoaters tend to lack empathy, shame, and guilt. But there is a way out. And believe me when I tell you, sweetness and light is not the path to resolving this pattern. I know the natural reaction is to shrink back in fear in the face of a bully, but this reaction strengthens the bully. Remember I said beneath their tough exteriors, bullies are weak and hurting. So the only way to break through to the weak and vulnerable side of the bully is to break through the hard defensive shell and crack it open. And this can't be done with a light, loving, and tender touch. So for all my patients who were bullies, the turning point always comes when I use sufficient emotional force to break their defensive armor. And the way to crack a bully's armor is hard confrontation, meaning you may have to come across as a very strong, almost stronger bully than the bully. And this way you break through to the wounded child that lives within. And suddenly the bullier remembers what it felt like to be bullied. And feeling his own unbearably painful feelings is the key to healing this pattern. Now comes the next step. You want to help the bullier feel for his or her victim. And when the old pain is palpable in the bully, when the scapegoater feels the pain that he or she felt as a kid, now you can evoke what we call partial identification, which is the ability to put oneself in another's emotional shoes. And now's the time to ask that question, why would you want to make someone you love feel the terrible pain you felt as a kid? And at this point, when the bullier's heart is bleeding, the bully can finally consider the effect his or her behavior has on others and feel empathy for the people that they're harming. And by encouraging identification with those who are being harmed, you can actually open the bully's heart and access his or her humanity. So if you're a bullier, the best way to wake up and face the music is to look at your family life. And if you are a parent and you have a child who's bullying others, take a look at yourself, because children are mirrors that reflect our own behavior back at us. And the ultimate solution to ending the epidemic of bullying is for all of us to have the strength to take ownership of our feelings of weakness, hurt, sadness, and anger and work them through rather than dump our pain onto others. Alrighty. So now, let me just give you a couple of tweets, and then I'm going to take a break. Bullying and scapegoating are one and the same. They come from not having the courage to admit your own pain. It's easy to turn others into emotional toilet bowls to avoid repairing our own emotional holes. Face your own pain rather than transfer the stain. Put your pain into words instead of turning someone else into a pile of turds. When you blame another, you are just running for emotional cover. Bullying creates a commotion that enables you to avoid your own emotion. And a sign that a marriage is on the skids when parents start ganging up on the kids. Alrighty, I'm going to take a brief break, and when I come on back, I'm going to introduce you to my guest, Jef. Come on back.
You're listening to Ask Dr. Love with Dr. Jamie Turndorf. To speak to Dr. Turndorf live on the air, call 888-463-6748. That's 888-463-6748. If you like what you're hearing, you can learn about Dr. Turndorf's techniques for turning conflict into connection and healing in her critically acclaimed, groundbreaking book, Till Death Do Us Part, Unless I Kill You First, a step-by-step guide for resolving relationship conflict. Find out more about this book and read a free excerpt by visiting AskDrLove.com. This is Ask Dr. Love with Dr. Jamie Turndorf. And if you have a question for her, please call in now at 888-463-6748. This show is for you, the listeners, so please give her a call now. You're listening to Ask Dr. Love with Jamie Turndorf, Ph.D. Once again, here's Dr. Love.
Hello again, and welcome back to Ask Dr. Love Radio. This is the second cold I've had in 3 months. Can you believe it? I haven't had a cold in like 10 years, and now I've had 2, so I've got the potato in my nose again. So, I want to welcome Jef Gazley, LMFT, licensed marriage and family therapist, to my show. He's practiced hypnosis and counseling since 1974, and he's the owner-operator of AskTheInternetTherapist.com since 1998. He's the author of 13 mental health, educational, and self-help DVDs, numerous hypnosis scripts available on CD, and he's written a book on distance counseling and another on tri-brain trauma therapy. And I just want to bring him on so you all can meet Jef and benefit from all his expertise. Are you there, Jef?
I am. How are you, Jamie?
Hello. Nice to hear you and have you on my show. So how are you? How's the weather in Arizona?
Oh, it's always great.
Yeah, really. You don't have a potato in your nose because you have sun.
At this point, yes.
There you go. So, Jef, I know that you specialize, among other things, in bullying, and I wanted you to talk a little bit more about your specialties and your background. Tell me a little bit about you.
Basically, you covered a tremendous amount of area today. It's been a really good show, and I was trying to figure out where I might be able to add in. And what I wanted to focus on mainly is what happens when somebody gets abused. What occurs is we have three separate brains. We have a prefrontal cortex, which is our conscious brain. We have a limbic system, which is more emotional, and an older brain. And then in the back part, in the medulla, we have a reptilian brain that is also connected to the body. And all three of those brains run on different tracks. And they talk to each other through particular gates. Now, when somebody gets abused, the first thing that happens is that we go into shock, which is very similar to spontaneous hypnosis. There's a blockage between the prefrontal cortex, which is logic, and the emotional brain, so that we can go ahead and survive. Unfortunately, when you're in hypnosis, you take in all the information spontaneously. So you incorporate the abuser and everything that they said and how you felt as the victim. And then the tendency is you walk away beating yourself up. And as you discussed, that's an untenable situation. At some point in time, you're going to either identify with the victim more and get involved with people abusing you, or you're going to identify with the abuser in a vain attempt to get power and start abusing other people. And that's how it tends to proliferate.
That's a brilliant description. And what you're saying is that it can go one of two ways. Either you become the abuser, having been abused, you identify with the abuser and become an abuser, or you become a perpetual victim.
Absolutely.
Either way. Right.
And so the real issue is how do we get away from the primitive parts of our brain? How do we deal with them and resolve those issues so that we can come from a logical point of view and choose to, in some ways, go against our more primitive nature, which is a pecking order and a tribal mentality.
That's great. You know, it's very interesting because when somebody goes the alternative track of I'm not going to be an abuser, but I'm going to stay a victim, I'm sure you notice how highly patterned that person's behavior is. I have a patient now who was so abused by her mother, and she married a man who is exactly like her verbally abusive mother, and she employs all the highly patterned ritualistic behavior that she did as a child, crying, pleading, begging, you know, everything that doesn't work. She just repeats it like a rat on a, you know, in a maze or, you know, a gerbil on a wheel.
Which is a perfect point. What happens is when we internalize dysfunction, when there is PTSD that gets stuck, and that certainly happens from abuse, we attempt we develop what's called a repetition compulsion, and we do the same thing over and over and over again in an attempt to resolve the issue. And unfortunately, it just perpetuates it. So what has to happen is you've got to get down into the basic tissue where the PTSD resides and resolve it at that issue. And there's only a few ways that you can do that. Hypnosis is one. It's a very good one. EMDR is another very valuable tool. But the one that I like best is energy psychology, which is based on Eastern medicine. EFT, TFT, and especially neuro-emotional technique.
NET, people call that too sometimes. Yep. NET. So want to describe for the listeners who may not be familiar with these methods how you actually get into the part of the brain and free it from the repetition.
Well, the neat thing is that when you get abused, your body remembers entirely how you felt and how it was maintained chemically in the body at that time. Mm-hmm. So if you think about any past abuse, your body brings it up as if it's happening in real time. Mm-hmm. That also allows you an area to get into, and you can do that with muscle testing. So basically what happens is our body is made out of water and electricity, and if you think about an issue and hold a strong arm and lock the muscle, it will probably weaken if the trauma is great enough, and if it's not, it will hold strong. With NET, what you can do is find out by the muscle testing what present issue is up and running and how it connects to any trauma in the past, just by essentially asking congruent or non-congruent muscle tests. It'll go down if you're on target, and it'll stay strong if you're not. And then you go to the meridian, which is a river of energy, Eastern medicine again, and you tap on a certain sequence on the back for each meridian. And what it does is pulls out the toxic energy out of the body. And that helps with the repetition compulsion. Then if you get the person to understand what's happening cognitively with the logical part of the brain, you've really got a complete treatment, and it breaks the PTSD repetition compulsion.
Yeah, it's a very effective technique. And, I understand that nobody fully understands why it works and how it works, the tapping, but, I often think of it as just the tapping is interrupting signals in some way. It's an energetic, frequency interruption.
Well, it's based on chiropractic and Eastern medicine, and basically what happens is the body is totally connected, and certain parts tend to help other parts. So when you're thinking of a particular issue, let's say of grief, the lung meridian is where that usually resides. So if you tap on those areas, it discharges the sadness or the grief.
Mm-hmm. It's so interesting, Jeff. Yesterday I had a remarkable experience with a woman who came in who was so miserable, and she kept on, it was sort of like I was listening to a refrain of almost a child crying, "Nobody understands my pain." And no matter, I could hear the traumatic aspect of it, and that she was weeping in this way. My mother doesn't understand. My brother doesn't understand. And they attack me. My mother says to me, "Well, if you won't take my advice, forget it." And the brother says, "Well, you think you're the only one who has a hard life?" And it was clear they weren't hearing what I call her emotional Morse code. She was really talking about something else from an earlier part of her life that was traumatizing. So I asked her, "What kind of a trauma did you go through? Something terrible happened to you." And she tells me that she was born with a malformed heart. And the pulmonic valve was obviously defective, and she wasn't getting enough air. But before she actually told me the story, she kept saying, "I'm always afraid that I'm going to faint. The world goes dark. I can't breathe." And it was clear she was describing a physical trauma. Well, she actually was remembering the trauma of her early congenital defect, right? It was in her body.
Absolutely.
Absolutely. So I stood up, and, I just said, I have to do something, and I put my hand on her heart. And as I laid my hand on her heart, the most miraculous thing happened. I've never felt this when working with a patient. I literally felt a jolt in her heart, as if paddles restarted it. Mm-hmm. Is that wild?
It's not, it is, and it isn't.
But I mean, the paddle thing was a very strong jolt, as if the trauma of the jolt because she had surgery at 9 months where they repaired her heart. So the jolt, the trauma of the paddles hitting her heart, was still in the tissue. Mm-hmm. Right? And then the laying of my hand on her released the trauma. And then she started talking about, "I feel somehow new. I feel born again." It was like also restarting her heart. It was a beautiful experience. But I didn't do tapping. It was just a laying of hands.
which is absolutely fine. It's another technique. There are so many different techniques that are just proliferating right now, but they're all based on the same thing. Mm-hmm. And they all work.
It's wonderful. Now, how did you, because you've been doing this for such a long time, and it's obvious that you're really expert in these body techniques and energy techniques, what got you interested in the first place in these methods?
Originally, I was working at a pain clinic. It was really my second job out of school, St. Joseph's Pain Clinic, and I learned a few things in the early 70s, and I got interested in hypnosis and TENS units and massage and that sort of thing. But eventually, I hurt my back, and I went through all the Western techniques, and nothing worked. And I finally walked into a chiropractor who did applied kinesiology, which is muscle testing. Mm-hmm. And after 15 years, I had 3 months of treatment, and then I was doing backflips on my trampoline.
Isn't it marvelous?
So it was incredible, but I thought it wasn't my field, and I just kind of went about my business and was just grateful. But at one point, I had an emotional issue that was connected to a body part, and he was able to bring that up, and I came jumping off the table and told him that he needed to teach me that. And he was doing NET.
Isn't that wonderful?
That was about 25 years ago.
Mm-hmm. So is a large part of your practice doing literally hands-on work with patients, not just internet therapy?
You know, the internet therapy, I mostly do a little bit of triage and education. It's a very small part of my work. Most of my work is hands-on. And I do NET with probably 90% of my clients. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Traditional psychotherapy as well, but there's just so much that you can learn by simply asking the body. You know, if you ask the prefrontal cortex, you're getting 15%. So
That's right.
I'd rather have the 85 from the subconscious.
Absolutely. I had a patient just before I came to do the radio show who was so traumatized and abused verbally by her mother, and she is now so highly addicted to being a suffering victim that it was so clear. She said to me that her husband, who's an MD, for the first time in their marriage, bought an extra ticket for her to accompany him to New Orleans to a conference. And can you imagine what a sign of progress of the work that we've been doing, that he wants to be with her, not escape her, to a conference. Mm-hmm. And she immediately starts to cry about how miserable she is. And I'm thinking, how can you turn this trip into misery? How can you do this? And I said to her, how? And she says, I don't know what to wear.
Oh, no.
And I said, listen, dude, you know what? I'm going to just buy a wardrobe, and I'm going to go so I can get this potato out of my nose. But she was doing the trauma thing. And, because her mother always put her down and she didn't dress right and she didn't look right. Trauma, it was just there. And she was so blind to it,
And that's exactly it, is that they are blind to it. In a sense, they're in a different time period. They're running from the subconscious. They're running from an earlier age.
Absolutely.
And logically, it often doesn't make sense to them, but they're still in it.
Absolutely. It reminds me of that movie, Moonstruck. Remember where Cher is talking to Nicolas Cage and he keeps saying, I love you. And she just says, snap out of it. Sometimes this is what you're doing with these physical techniques. It's snap out of it. Snap out of this regression, the past trauma, the trauma brain, this vortex of trauma, and come on back to the present. I'm going to take a break, Jeff, and I'll be back with you in a moment on Ask Dr. Love Radio.
You're listening to Ask Dr. Love with Dr. Jamie Turndorf. To speak to Dr. Turndorf live on the air, call 888-463-6748. That's 888-463-6748. If you've recently been through a breakup and are looking for a second chance, wondering how you can reconcile with your ex, or if it's even possible after all you've been through, Dr. Turndorf's latest book, Make Up, Don't Break Up, presents her 5-step plan for reconciling with your ex. This plan was developed out of years of research, working with thousands of couples at her Center for Emotional Communication. This is a proven no-hype and no-nonsense method that gets right to the root of the problem to guide you to the right path towards reigniting a lasting relationship. For more about Make Up, Don't Break Up, visit AskDrLove.com. You're listening to Ask Dr. Love with Jamie Turndorf, Ph.D. Once again, here's Dr. Love.
Hello again, and welcome back to Ask Dr. Love Radio. I'm Dr. Jamie Turndorf, and with me is my guest, Jef Gazley, LMFT. We're talking about bullying and the trauma brain and how to use neuroemotional technique and other techniques to break free. Jef, let's talk a little bit about specifically how you use neuroemotional technique with a bully.
You know, what I tend to do in my work is I generally am talking with the person prefrontal cortex to prefrontal cortex. In other words, they're telling me their story. But what I'm paying attention to is the tone of voice and the way that the body reacts. And so if I see a flush to the face, a shock reaction in the eyes, then I'll go ahead and ask them to stand up, and I'll just simply muscle test how they're feeling. And usually what occurs is that we'll find an earlier trauma where they've been abused, and we'll take that out and then sit back down and talk again with the prefrontal cortex about what happened. In other words, usually this kind of stuff happens most often in families. So we're going to deal with the whole idea of dysfunctional family theory and how shame gets transferred over and over and over again, and how we usually expect people to be perfect and in control, and how impossible that is. So essentially what I'm trying to do is tiptoe through all the brains and not leave one of them left out.
Tiptoe through the tulips. Oh, excuse me. You made me think of a song. It's very true. You have to touch all those levels of the brain or you don't get resolution.
Absolutely.
Right. And you may not do tapping. You may not need to. Sometimes are you able to get access without doing the muscle work and the tapping?
You know, one of the things that you can certainly do, and something that I did for years before I learned NET, is to have the person act out their anger or their grief in a controlled environment. So the real difficult thing is that when you have too much emotion or it is too spontaneous, that's an indication that you're really in history. And what you want to teach the client to do at that point is to do absolutely nothing. Because if you just react, you're going to be in the midst of that repetition compulsion. You're going to abuse somebody else or freeze, one of the two. And instead, what you want to do is try to remember where the abuse happened, and then you can get it out in a controlled environment. So I used to have a punching bag in my office, and would have people go ahead and use it that way. And if you muscle test them afterwards, the trauma will not show up.
See, I'm very circumspect about having people go into action in order to vent feelings, because obviously we want to teach people to be less behaviorally reactive and more, verbally mature and relational and so on. So I always have found, this is just my style, my technique, that they might describe what they would like to do, but I don't work that way with people, having them go into action. And for me also, I've found that there's a danger with becoming physical in venting, because it can have a flooding effect where you can actually get yourself more worked up. So that's just my style. But everybody, there's a lot of research that says that therapists have different techniques and different methods, but it doesn't really matter what your discipline and orientation is. If you're a good therapist, you all get to the same end result.
Absolutely. And the real issue is that you've got to discharge the energy somehow. It is much easier to do it with something like NET.
Right.
No doubt about it. And to be able to do that kind of recreating, the person has to have a pretty good, strong sense of each part of the brain so that they aren't just reacting without thinking, because that's what they're doing just in general.
Right, and then that just
transfer the shame.
Right, and transfers, and then they have more acting out and more behavioral raging and so on. When patients come in and they want to shake my hand, I'll say, don't even touch me, because then when you're mad at me, you'll think to go into action and belt me. So it sounds very crazy, but that discipline helps people then discharge the feeling in words, which I think is very beneficial. So talk to me a little bit about ADD care.
Sure. One of the things that happened by learning applied kinesiology and then going ahead and doing NET is I finally found the points for the neurotransmitters on the body. And again, it was that chiropractor who, after about 5 years, asked me if I might find that useful. And yeah, I think I could find that useful. And what you can do with applied kinesiology is you can test foods, vitamins, and supplements, again, by the muscle testing. So I just did a lot of experimenting, and there's a point, it's called the polarity point, that should run a particular way if the main meridian in the body is running appropriately. With ADD, it runs the opposite way. And so what I did is tested a number of stimulants to see if it would change the muscle test the right way. And stimulants are the typical treatment for ADD, and it proved to be very consistent. So I went searching for something natural and found a proprietary homeopathic blend that seemed to do the trick. At that point, we went over to the Amen Clinic with a number of my clients and went head-to-head against Adderall, and we met or beat their performance on the SPECT scans, which are a brain scan, and the Conners impulsivity test. So it was really quite remarkable.
Wow. So how can people take advantage of this? How would they reach out to you through Ask the Internet Therapist or what?
We do have it available on Ask the Internet Therapist, but it's also available at addcare.com. And then in Arizona, it's in a few vitamin shops, Healthy Habit and Cooper's Nutrition, and it's on Amazon as well.
And it's called ADD Care?
Right.
So this is just one of the tools that you use as part of your practice.
Well, one of the things that I found, and it's something that we haven't really talked about, is we've talked about the ways that shame gets transferred in abuse and bullying, but bullying can also occur because of chemical problems. So if somebody has a hot cingulate system, which is the middle part of their brain, they pick on people. They poke at them. They tend to get obsessive, and bullying is not only physical, but emotional. Also, people with ADD, if it's untreated, often poke people. And so that kind of bullying can't really be stopped just by emotional techniques. The chemistry actually has to be righted, and the real issue is, do you need to do that with pharmaceuticals, which can have some side effects, or can you do it naturally? If I have a choice, I always want to go natural, although I'm not opposed to pharmaceuticals when needed.
Also people do not realize the profound impact on the body chemistry of the things we put in our mouths, the foods we eat, right?
Everything is chemistry.
It's incredible because there are people. I had a patient, this was 30 years ago. He came into Craig House Hospital, which was this posh private psychiatric hospital where I was on staff, and he would come in 4 times a year like clockwork for shock therapy because of an intractable depression. And I had the intuition that he was suffering from a brain allergy to wheat. People think, most allergies will just cause a skin rash or a runny nose, but it can target any part of your body, including your brain. And I said, just do me a favor and eliminate wheat. Just do it for a few days a week. But this was way before we even thought about how it could affect the brain, wheat. And he took the wheat out, and his depression lifted. I never saw that man again. Ever again. So
I'll tell you another story that really impressed me. I had a client come in on an emergency basis, a 22-year-old woman, and she had been cut off in traffic, and she had a half-ton pickup. Went on a race following him, and when he parked, she slammed into the car. And what she had was ADD. And it took us about 3 weeks to get her in to see a psychiatrist. And I did not have AdCare developed at that time, so the only interventions that I made is suggested that she get on GABA, G-A-B-A.
Oh, yeah.
A natural amino acid that just slows the neurofiring, helping to calm people down. So all the tranquilizers and the mood stabilizers work on the GABA pathway. The other thing I did is tested her for sugar allergy.
Right.
And we took her off sugar, and within 3 days, her entire personality had flipped.
There you go.
Mild, and she was apologetic.
There you go. Absolutely. My housekeeper has, this woman is so wired that she hardly ever lands. And if you look at her diet, she'll take the whipped cream. I always tell Donna, you're killing yourself. She takes whipped cream and shoots it right in her mouth.
Oh, God.
She is such a sugaraholic, and I guarantee you it is totally jacking up her brain.
Yeah.
And she's been this way since she was a child. But then, of course, it's a chicken and egg question because the sugar addictions, the food addictions are a symptom of neurotransmitter imbalances in the brain. And then that in turn is connected to the bowel, and the hip bone's connected to the knee bone.
Yes. And the neat thing is with applied kinesiology, you can check all that out.
Wonderful.
And really find out what's primary.
So tell me, I want to do whatever I can to promote what you'd like to promote. Tell my listeners anything that you'd like them to know, that you'd like them to buy, anything that you're offering besides ADD care and your website, anything.
Well, what I provide is a number of DVDs that were really made for both clients and clinicians, and there's a series of 9 regular mental health videos that deal with issues like codependence and chemical dependence and dysfunctional family, and that's the emotional side of things, the shame side. And then I have a series of energy psychology videos as well that deal with the back parts of the brain. Again, you don't want to forget one of the brains. And then for any chemistry issue, we have a complete line of mental health supplements for everything except schizophrenia or bipolar, which is pretty amazing. All natural, and they tend to work amazingly well.
Oh, I love to know about that, and I know my listeners do too. I am so glad you came on the show. You are a wonderful guest. You explain yourself beautifully, and there's a great warmth about you and a caring, and it's really been my pleasure to get to know you better.
I enjoyed it. Thank you so much.
And I hope you'll come back. So that's all I have for you all on Ask Dr. Love Radio, and I want you to just remember, when it comes to bullying, look in the mirror. Study yourself with a very, very honest eye. Watch your children. See how they're behaving. They're the mirror to how you're doing and how well you're behaving. Because bullying is within your control, and you can stop it, and you can change the world. You can be the pebble in the pond. See you next week on Ask Dr. Love.